Hello and welcome. Thanks for coming to join our panel today. We have a great panel of three women working in climate on California issues, and so I think there's going to be a lot of interesting information and plenty of opportunity for questions, so start thinking of those now. I'm going to start with just a quick introduction of the three panelists. Edie's going to provide some overview slides, followed by remarks from Claire and Jenny, and then I'll have a couple questions, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. So that's the plan for the panel. By way of introduction, I just want to say that Edie Chang, to my left, is Deputy Executive Director of the Air Resources Board. She's responsible for development and implementation of California's climate programs. She's a longtime California resident with degrees from Berkeley and from Irvine. To her left is Claire Jahns, Assistant Secretary for Climate Issues at the Resources Agency. She has degrees from Yale, and in her relatively short career has already completed the trifecta of working for government, for the for-profit and for the nonprofit sector, so has a very broad base of experience. And to her left is Jenny Lester Moffitt, Undersecretary at the California Department of Food and Agriculture. She has degrees from Brown University and is a fifth-generation family farmer in California, deep roots in the state. And with that brief introduction, I want to turn it over to Edie with some slides about the scoping plan.
Okay, so I thought I would kick this off with just a really short, and I'm going to go really fast, figuring that having more time to have discussion both with Jenny and Claire and with all of you is probably better, and most of you have probably know something about the scoping plan. So are they going to come up? Slides? No?
No? Do we have the clicker here?
I have no clicker. I don't. Or we won't have slides, and I'll just talk really fast, and I'll point at pictures for you. So why don't I go ahead and get started, because there's a little bit of technical confusion. So the scoping plan is basically what California calls our plan for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. This plan was first required in the 2006 AB 32, which set out greenhouse gas goals for the state of California. And we're required to update the plan every 5 years, or we can do it more frequently if we want to or if we're told to do it. So this round of the scoping plan, we began it in 2015, late 2015, and it was really focused on meeting the governor's midterm target. So the governor laid out a goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions 40% by 2030, and we asked the Air Resources Board to start a scoping plan process, work with all of the other agencies to describe how we were going to meet that goal. In California, I think as much as, just like other areas, we are seeing the impacts of climate change. And we have when you look at the fires that we experienced over the last several years, the drought, these are all things that are causing real impacts in California. And in fact, in 2015, the drought cost the agricultural industry just in the Central Valley an estimated $2.7 billion and 20,000 jobs. So these are having real impacts in California right now. When we look at where the emissions are in California, there's a slide of a pie chart, but what you see is almost 40% of the emissions come from the transportation sector. So transportation, we've done a lot on transportation, but it's still a huge sector in California, and as we go out into the future, it continues to be a huge sector. It's really important that we tackle that. The next largest sector is in the industrial sector, so about 20% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from the industrial sector, and about 20% of our emissions come from electricity. So this is for, what year is this? 2015. So those are kind of the major areas that we tackle in the scoping plan, but it's also important to tackle areas that don't seem as big now but have large growth potential. Perfect. Can we go to the one that has they probably have a clicker. So high GWP gases like refrigerants. So they're only 4% of our inventory now, but the growth is astronomical. So we're looking at things that we can do to reduce emissions from high global warming potential gases as well. One of the things that's not included, when you see our pies of greenhouse gas emissions, one of the things that's not included is emissions from the natural and working land sector. So these are emissions that are harder to characterize, harder to project out into the future, and we haven't fully integrated them into our system, but they're really important, they're really critical as we think about our broader climate solutions and actually addressing global warming. Oops. That's it. So that's the slide that looks at. So I wanted to mention that, and especially because as California thinks about what our climate strategy looks at going forward, a greater focus on natural and working lands is something that we all know is important. We're going to talk about that a little more on this panel. So as I mentioned, we did our first scoping plan in 2008. So it's been about 10 years since we laid out our first plan for how we were going to reduce greenhouse gases in California. And one of the things that's really important from our perspective to point out is that in California, our economy continues to grow. And what we're also seeing is that our gross state product is increasing while our greenhouse gas emissions are decreasing. So we're becoming a more energy efficient and carbon efficient state. But I think it's also important for us to take a look at what our targets are going forward. So the 2020 target, when you look at it relative to where we need to go, is really very modest. And we are looking, from the time we did the scoping plan until 2020, we were looking at maybe a 1 to 2% per year decrease in greenhouse gas emissions. To hit the 2030 goal, we need to double that. We need to do about 4% a year. It's a 40% reduction in 10 years. So these are really aggressive reductions that we're looking at in California going out into the future. So how are we going to do this? So this is our portfolio. This builds on programs that we are already implementing at the Air Resources Board. So our traditional role at the ARB is that we regulate air pollution. And these climate programs build on the programs that we're doing to continue to reduce pollution in the Los Angeles and the San Joaquin areas, and it builds on the programs that we're doing to reduce emissions from the freight sector, which is one of the largest polluting sectors in California. So we're looking at things like increasing building efficiency. Right now, the scoping plan has a 50% renewable power reflecting current legislation. There is conversation in our legislature about bumping that up. They've said 100% renewables in California is one of the conversations that's happening in the legislature. The low carbon fuel standard, there was a session this morning, and I think there's a LCFS market forecast right now, but what can we do for low carbon fuels? We're in the process of doing a rulemaking on that right now. I want to highlight the walkable and bikeable communities. We talk a lot about reducing VMT, about trying to get people to drive less. What we're trying to do is also realize that how we get people to do those things makes a difference. So if we can get people to drive less by walking more and biking more, having more active transportation, that has huge public health benefits. The public health benefits of getting people active are actually they way outstrip the public health benefits of the air pollution reductions associated with that. So we're trying to think more holistically about how we can implement strategies that have broader benefits. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about some of the ones on the other side, but we do have a cap and trade program that caps emissions from about 80 to 85% of the emissions on that pie chart. And I also do want to point out that one of the important elements of our program is that we take the proceeds from the cap and trade auctions and we invest them in our communities. By law, a certain percentage of those funds have to go to disadvantaged communities and investments in those communities, and we're seeing huge benefits from those programs as well. So what does this mean for California? We think that the scoping plan can have huge economic benefits for our state as well. There was a slide about health benefits of the scoping plan in 2030, and I took that one out for the sake of saving time. But we see health benefits as we reduce greenhouse gas emissions and associated other pollutants. And we also see this is sort of a looking backwards view of what renewable energy projects can do in just one region of the state. And we think that we can continue to reap those benefits going forward as well. So I'm going to close on some key points here, and I'm not going to read them all, but basically the scoping plan is our vision of how we can reach the 2030 goal. We are going to continue to evaluate the measures that are in the scoping plan as we implement them. It is a plan. We're moving into the implementation piece of that now, and what that means is that every agency that has responsibility is taking a deeper look at what needs to be done and how it can actually be done and how we can meet the targets in the scoping plan. On the ARB side, I mentioned some of the big areas. Just last month, we adopted refrigerant regulations to fill the gap for some EPA regulations that are not moving forward. Our low carbon fuel standard, we're going to be extending the targets to 2030 at our April board meeting. We're working closely with CDFA and stakeholders on a dairy work group to address methane emissions from the dairy industry. Working closely with CDFA resources and a lot of other agencies on natural and working lands implementation, and continuing to put funds out the door to invest in our communities. So that's kind of the very quick snapshot of what's in our scoping plan, and be happy to take questions when we get into the panel discussion.
Thank you, Edie. Claire?
Thank you. Yes, and so I'm Claire Jahns with the Natural Resources Agency, and our agency and our departments, I would say, have benefited greatly, although some would say not enough, from cap and trade revenue that Edie discussed. So I'll get into that a bit, because that type of spending and the type of work that those programs are funding is the kind of thing we want to continue to do more of as we expand out our natural and working lands strategy. So I wanted to talk about briefly, because I know the questions are more interesting than hearing me talk, about what is our natural and working lands strategy. So in California's climate policy has always considered the land base in one way or another. Probably the most salient example, especially if there are any traders in the room, is inclusion of forests and improved agricultural management practices, et cetera, in the compliance market offset program. So that's really been there since the outset. And now the types of things we started to fund with cap and trade revenue since I think 2014 was the first appropriation, have included agricultural and forest land conservation, coastal and Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta restoration, healthy soils and soil carbon, which Jenny's agency leads, improved forest management, reforestation practices, mountain meadow restoration. So a whole suite of land protection and improved management strategies on private lands as well as some public lands that are designed to pull carbon dioxide out of the air and sequester it or reduce emissions. And I think one trend that has emerged since 2014 that was really taken hold and certainly captured the governor's interest has been the increased incidence of catastrophic wildfires. So we've had wildfire years in California where emissions from forest fires like the Rim Fire in the Sierra have actually outstripped the emission reductions gained through the cap and trade program. So while we're not comparing apples to apples in saying that, I think it's important to note because the magnitude is significant. And so as California begins to think about how we start to hit that long-term target, and that's why we established these 2030 targets, we also start to think of, okay, what do we need to kind of sweep out from under the rug that we have not been looking at? And certainly things like forest fires and potential losses from of carbon from the land base has been one of those. Because I think we're looking not just at continuing to hit the targets that the legislature and governors past and governors current have set for us, but also globally, what do the emission reductions need to be to mitigate the risk of catastrophic climate change? And so what we're hearing certainly on the horizon from the world's leading scientists is that we have to be at negative emissions by mid-century, 0 or negative emissions by mid-century, not just 80% below as we've been working so hard to get to. So things like talking about how we increase carbon sequestration in the land base and generate what some call negative emissions becomes relevant there. So quickly, I touched on some of the programs that are being funded through cap and trade dollars. I think we consider those sort of the technologies, if you will, in the natural and working land sector. So we don't have Teslas or solar power necessarily, but we have trees that grow and go through photosynthesis, and eelgrass that grows in the bay and pulls carbon dioxide and stores it as carbon in the ocean sediment. So there are all of these natural resource technologies essentially that we can harness to start to generate these negative emission strategies. And so we set out, in the scoping plan sets, I think it got quickly flipped through in the slide there, we set a target in the scoping plan for the first time to reduce emissions from this sector by 15 to 20 million metric tons carbon dioxide equivalent by 2030. So that's really the first time there's been sort of an all lands carbon strategy in California. There has been one for forests for a while and sort of a regulatory system that supports that for commercial forestry. But we're really taking an all lands approach in California, looking at forests, wetlands, agricultural lands, grasslands, urban trees, and urban greening is significant. And so when you do that, you want to understand, okay, how do we hit a target like that we've set for ourselves? And so in the past year or so and ongoing through the end of this year, we'll be developing what's called the Natural and Working Lands Implementation Plan, and it's due, I think, at the end of November. I got that date marked on my calendar. And so to do that, we're really starting with that question of what is our emission reduction target, and how do we meet that? And so we actually, through the process of writing this plan, the scoping plan left us some opportunity to change what that eventual 2030 target is. So we'll be evaluating, is that the right target? Is it ambitious enough? Is it too ambitious? Kind of what was the reality of hitting it, and also kind of further defining it. And then we're also developing projections for what sort of the business as usual and with policy, if you will, emissions in this space will be. So we're working with Lawrence Berkeley Labs to develop those projections, and that'll get used in this plan to both inform the eventual target that we have, as well as help us spell out how we're going to get there. Because we really see this plan as looking back at the legacy of conservation and land management that California has had. I mean, I couldn't enumerate the dollars, the billions of dollars that the Natural Resource Agency and others have spent through the goodwill of California taxpayers on conservation and land management to protect the resources of this state. There's a $4 billion ballot, actually, a ballot initiative on the ballot this June, the Parks and Recreation Bond that actually includes spending for carbon, as well as spending on climate resilience, so adaptation. And it actually includes funding that will help the resource agency run a monitoring program, for example, for implementing projects related to carbon. So we really look at the existing projects we have and new projects like the Healthy Soils Initiative and think of how we can grow those, track them to better understand their carbon benefits, and recognize them as working towards the eventual goal that they had. So I think just to throw some, we talked a little bit about statistics of what emissions from forest fires might be, but I think it's really important to recognize the potential of this sector to significantly add to the emission reduction statewide that we have, because if we do look for something like carbon neutrality, or just how do we build in kind of a buffer or something within our emission reductions pathway, really like what is the opportunity from natural working lands becomes significant. So offsets have generated a significant amount that is sort of already accounted for, of course, because they're offsetting emissions in the covered sector. But even in the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund funded projects alone that have just been implemented or funded through over the last 3 years will generate an expected over 19 million metric tons of carbon dioxide reductions over their lifetime. So that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg. I think we've spent something like $630 million or has been allocated to that, and actually not all that has been spent yet, so that the carbon dioxide reductions will be more. But as we look at adding a $4 billion bond and additional spending, and also spending on other agricultural sector emission reductions and other activities related to commercial forest lands, I think we can even grow that number significantly. So we're looking forward to a busy year and looking forward to answering questions.
Hey, good afternoon. Again, my name is Jenny Lester Moffitt, and I'm the Undersecretary at the Department of Food and Agriculture. As Edie mentioned, and as we saw on the pie chart that she had listed, or that's shown us, agriculture represents about 8% of the overall greenhouse gas emissions here in California. That is currently measured in the inventory. So we're here because agriculture is part of our climate emissions. Agriculture is also definitely part of the solution as well, and is immensely impacted by climate change. Edie talked about the drought and the impacts of drought. There was a recent report that just came out through UC Merced as well that talks about the impacts of climate change on agriculture in California. And they're pretty immense. So a lot of our crops require winter chill. That means adequate chill time during the winter and consistent chill time. And as we all know very well, that our climate is changing, the consistencies that we might have appreciated in the weather before are becoming a little bit less consistent. And so cherries, other crops that require those winter chill are going to be affected. So we know the importance of climate change and climate solutions for agriculture. We're definitely, through the National Working Lands Implementation Plan, I'm not going to cover a lot too much beyond what Claire already talked about. We're part of that group, and we've been partner and working with our sister agencies on that. A big part of that, as Claire mentioned, is for agriculture, is on healthy soils. This has been something that we've been working on at our department for a few years now, really looking at the ability for soil carbon sequestration to not only to play a role in carbon sequestration, but also managing soils for other benefits as well. Edie talked about the public health benefits for active transportation. There's a lot of other benefits for soil management practices that extend beyond the climate benefits and the necessary climate benefits of soils. For water quality, for dust control, for managing diseases, those sorts of things. So we as a department have been working a lot with our sister agencies on healthy soils. But what I really wanted to talk today about was one thing that Edie had mentioned, which is the short-lived climate pollutants strategy and methane reductions. So again, 8% of our emissions in the state is coming from agriculture. Over half of that is methane from dairy agriculture, dairy and other livestock agriculture, but primarily dairy. Part of the scoping plan, part of our climate solutions in the state is a reduction, a goal to reduce methane emissions from dairy agriculture, dairy and other livestock agriculture by 40% by 2030. So that's an ambitious goal. It's part of all of our ambitious goals that we have in the state, and we're committed to making sure that we get to that goal in the time needed, because it is, as we all know, methane is an important short-lived climate pollutant that we need to be focused on. So as we think about and as we work on that, Edie mentioned that we have some working groups. This was through the legislation that passed in 2016, SB 1383, which is legislation that was passed that actually mandates and requires the Air Resources Board, should we don't meet the trajectory of reductions by 2024, to start imposing and implementing a regulation on methane reduction. What it does first is it tells us as the Department of Food and Agriculture the California Air Resources Board, and 2 others of our sister agencies, the Public Utilities Commission and the Energy Commission, to convene a working group with the stakeholders, with the industry, with partners in the industry, to really look at identifying what are the challenges for methane emissions, for meeting those emissions reductions, and what are the solutions. And a big part of that is on digester technology. Another part is on non-digester technology. We call them alternative manure management. It's basically lumping everything that's non-digester technology into that. And then the final one is really looking at the research component, specifically on enteric fermentation, and looking at certainly manure management is a big part of that, but there's also other methane emissions that is coming out of our livestock as well. So those 3 work groups have been meeting for the past year. There's been a lot of action taking place. The big thing, though, is that part of this solution package was also coupled with some money that was passed through the legislature last year for methane reduction. So we have our both dairy digester research and development program, and also our alternative manure management program. We are in the process of rolling out that money. We received $99 million in this past year. We have funded a substantial amount of dairy digesters here in California. I don't know how much we were at the beginning, but through it all, we have funded, I think, somewhere around, let's see. In our first round, we funded 6 digester projects, and then another 18 so far in our next round, and then we're currently reviewing the $99 million round. So we're really starting on a huge exponential curve up in digester technology. This was the result of other working groups that identified some of the other challenges for implementing digesters. We have work groups galore in our state. We love work groups. And they do take a lot of time and energy for sure, but they do accomplish, and the Dairy Digester Working Group really did accomplish, and it looked at finding those solutions, whether they primarily air quality solutions, that we had best available control technology to really get those digesters permitted here in the state, but also water quality as well. So those 3 working groups are meeting. The Public Utilities Commission has come out with their grant proposal already. We, for 5 digester projects, really looking at what we call the different cluster developments that are going on in the state. So as we're funding digesters, we're giving priority. There's extra credit essentially in the scoring criteria for digesters that are going toward either renewable fuel through pipeline interjection or transportation fuels, and a lot of that is these cluster developments. So there's clusters of dairies that are putting digesters in. They're piping that fuel to one central cleaning station to clean that fuel so that it can be used either for transportation fuels or for pipeline interconnection. So we're really working with a lot of our sister agencies on really encouraging and increasing that as we talk about our sustainable freight plans and all the other integrated plans that we have throughout the state. There's a lot of opportunity for low carbon transportation fuels that come from the dairy industry, and so it's a perfect marriage, if you will. So that's all I'm going to talk about for now. So we have plenty of time for conversation.
Well, thanks. I hope that everybody's gotten a sense now of the wide array of things that we're doing in California to try and meet our legislative mandate for reductions. I have a couple questions I want to start with. And the first is, as a state, we no longer have what we enjoyed before, a collaborative relationship with the federal government on climate policy. And I think that's exemplified by the recent announcement of an intent to roll back the federal vehicle standards and potentially revoke California's vehicle waiver. So I'm wondering if you all could comment on what the change in the federal administration means in terms of California's ability to achieve our climate goals, how we might respond, and obstacles and opportunities that we see going forward.
So things have changed with the federal government, but there are, I think from our perspective, and I think really from the governor has set the tone, that there are places that California wants to work with the federal government as much as we can. So we're, looking to see what the federal government is actually going to implement. What we found is that sometimes there are lots of statements that are made, but you have to actually look and see what the action is. And once the action is actually taken, then we need to figure out what is the appropriate response. That being said, there are a lot of places where we, from the climate perspective and from the air pollution perspective, have had to sort of throw up, I would say like sort of the brakes or something and say, hey, there are things that you're trying to do that, they fly in the face of the record that was established for rulemaking or for different kinds of things. So we're trying to make sure that as the federal government is taking these actions, they're looking at the full array, the full background and record of decisions that have been made in the past, and that things are done in the right way. I think that when you talk about for example, the EPA announcement about the rollback on the vehicle standards, I think this is obviously a huge deal for us. California is the only state that has the ability to set our own motor vehicle standards, partly because we set our standards before US EPA did, and we have a huge need in California from a pollution and from a climate change perspective. So our standards are set under state law. They are set through 2025, and they're an important component of meeting our scoping plan and meeting also our air quality plans. We went through a technical review of those standards and confirmed that those standards are technically feasible, and we are starting to take action to develop a rulemaking to extend those standards post-2025. That's something that we would do under our authority and under the waiver authority, and we need those reductions to meet our scoping plan objectives. I think changing the Clean Air Act is a big lift. I think that I'm not even going to begin to speculate about how or if that would happen. But we do need those reductions. When you looked at the pie chart, it was not up there very long, but the pie chart is, when you looked at it, 37% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from transportation. So we can't hit a 40% reduction goal without transportation making a significant impact. We can't hit a zero or a net negative by mid-century without transportation obviously playing a huge role. So we have to figure out a way to get those reductions.
I would add, at the Natural Resource Agency and our departments like CAL FIRE, federal land ownership and management agencies are obviously critically important to CAL FIRE. There is the Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, and they're the ones out there fighting forest fires that they happen. And a good number of those are started on federal lands, and so we work very, very closely, just from a pure health and safety perspective with the Forest Service, but also on resource management. And so, we, to be honest, haven't seen a big shift in our federal land management partners we work with in California, because they tend to be the regional foresters and the unit foresters, kind of. And I would echo what Edie says. It's really important to wait and see what the action is after all the blusters and tweets are done, because in this bill that passed, actually this budget that passed included a federal fire fix, is what it's called in the forestry world, where money wouldn't be taken from the restoration budget of the U.S. Forest Service to fund wildfire. There'd be separate pots of money. That's been a legislative priority of the California Natural Resource Agency for years. We actually joked, what are we going to do now in Washington once that was passed? That's really significant news that something like that would have been in this budget. So it'll be interesting to see, and we've seen, it seems like in ag, I'm sure Jenny pays much more attention to these than I do, but when push comes to shove, senators and local elected officials are there and representing the interests of their constituents on the land use side. But certainly, we need partners in the federal government. So I think we'll continue to operate as we always have, and working with our federal agency partners and the administration, but then also, taking a defensive line where needed. And I think not so much on these issues yet, but we've certainly seen our Attorney General become quite active in immigration debates and other things.
So I'll say that our partnership with the United States Department of Agriculture has continued, and we have many cooperative agreements with our department and USDA, and actually our partnerships that we've had with the Natural Resources Conservation Services, which is within the Department of Agriculture. They continue to support the programs that we have been rolling out that have been our climate programs. So our Healthy Soils program, as we developed our Healthy Soils program, it was in strong partnership with the Natural Resource Conservation Services. They have been working on soils since the 1930s, since we had the Dust Bowl. So soils is not necessarily, a primary climate focus for USDA, but much more a broader focus for agriculture in general, and managing and keeping our soils for so many different reasons. And so there is certainly an importance on soils for so many different reasons. And so they continue to support, and actually they continue to reach out to us and say, well, as we roll out these programs, can we continue to provide technical assistance? And so there are positions that are available for technical assistance through NRCS and through the resource conservation districts to be able to provide technical assistance for growers who want to apply for our money. Likewise, the same thing with our dairy digester program. There is money through also the USDA for dairy digesters. EPA also has money for dairy digesters. Again, a lot of the solutions and the programs that we have been running are programs that have climate benefits, absolutely are critical climate benefits. They also have a lot of market-based mechanisms, and I think as we continue to focus on and talk about the importance to agriculture, the importance for our climate, certainly for dairies, as the dairies can look to expand and look at their portfolio, and as not only milk producers but also renewable energy producers, that is a huge benefit for the market for dairies, and something that I think that very, very many people in our administration and also in the federal administration recognize that benefit. So we have continued. I say it's certainly not been it's not the same as it was before, but there's a lot of opportunities to find those common grounds and to keep on moving forward, and we have been very successful in continuing with that traction.
Thank you. I wanted to ask, jumping ahead to this coming September, we've got in San Francisco upcoming Global Action Climate Summit that our Governor Brown is going to be leading, bringing in parties from around the world, jurisdictions, actors that are working on climate. And I'm wondering if you could take a minute to talk about your plans, activities, hopes, objectives for the summit, things you're hoping to accomplish. I imagine many of the people in the audience will be in attendance or hoping to participate in that as well. Maybe you can give folks a highlight of what's coming up.
Sure, I'll start and then chime in. All our hopes and dreams are happening in September here in San Francisco. No, so September 12th through 14th is the Global Climate Action Summit just down the street. I think it's at the Moscone Center. And it's I think a celebration and a call to action for particularly subnational jurisdictions, if you will. There'll be plenty of national representatives there from around the world. We're expecting, I think, around 3,500 kind of credentialed delegates and many thousands more in conference rooms and in the streets around the city, to be sure. And it's co-chaired by Governor Brown, Patricia Espinosa, Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, Michael Bloomberg, formerly of New York, now the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy for Cities and Climate Change, and Anand Mahindra, the chair of the Mahindra Group. And it's really drawing in people, again, from around the United States, from around the world, focusing on how can we do more. So it's really going to be those delegates that are going to be in attendance are going to be asked to report on the commitments they've made and how they've delivered on them, and then how they're going to double down or triple down on efforts going forward. So it's really has its sights set on upholding the world's commitment to the Paris Accord, to be sure, and looking at how we can prevent catastrophic climate change and get to, zero emissions potentially even by mid-century. And so what we're doing at the state is there are sort of 5 challenge areas, if you will, that really span the gamut of climate change activities from land on the land stewardship side, of course, to transportation sector and everywhere else. There's a whole group looking at financing, another group looking at kind of communities and workforce and environmental justice issues. And we're all pretty excited about it. I think it's all our second or third job on top of doing our regular jobs. But I think this is an important, kind of going back to the first question, California, we don't want to underestimate the need we have to have willing partners at the federal level. But I think one thing California has done, to echo the panel this morning, is reach out to other jurisdictions around the world and ask them to join us and ask them to teach us what they know best, and to be willing to help them learn what California's pathway has been. So I think that'll be a big theme of this conference. There's a website, globalclimateactionsummit.org, and you can sign up there for updates.
So in addition to the main summit, and I'm sure I would expect that probably half of the people in this room are aware of all of the affiliated events that are being talked about. There are a bunch of affiliated events that will be in conjunction with the climate summit. The climate summit, the main event is really just the stake in the ground, and then there's so much more through the affiliated events. And so before the climate summit, I believe there will be a science day. There's oceans that are being talked about. We will be hosting a Climate Smart Ag affiliated event the day or two prior to the climate summit, and we're convening our stakeholders to really start to shape that now. So certainly if you're interested in what that might look like, you can definitely reach out to me afterward. The climate summit, I think, as Claire really well said, is it's a celebration because we have been working so hard in this arena and been accomplishing a lot, and it's a call to action because just as we need to recognize the work that we've done looking back, we also need to realize that there's more that needs to be done, and that us as subnations, us as states can do a lot. Us as businesses and business partners have a huge role in that. So we're looking, especially in agriculture, at what does that look like? What are the business partners that have been playing a big role? And there are a ton of companies, procurement through food and ag, that are play a huge role in shaping our climate reductions. So we're really looking at the business community as well to really step to the plate.
I would just add that this summit is really one of a series of events that are going to happen over the next year and over actually the next year after that. The summit, it is a call to action to ask folks to enhance our commitments at the non-party level to help encourage parties when they go to Poland this winter in the stock take to be confident that they can commit to more. So we know we need to go beyond Paris. And this is hopefully a way to show that we are all behind all of the non-parties. So as they move forward, they can be confident that there is this movement behind them.
Thanks, and I'm looking forward to seeing all of you in San Francisco in September. It sounds like an exciting event. I had another question, but I wanted to see if we have questions from the audience and make sure we have time for a couple questions from the audience. Anything out there? Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead with my question. Anybody? There will be an opportunity. Okay. So in addition to the change at the federal level, we're also, we have elections coming up in November. And our governor is going to be, I guess 4 terms is the most that he can do at this point. So Jerry Brown, who's led the state for the past 8 years and supported very ambitious climate action at the state and international level, will be, I guess, going back to his ranch. And we have a couple candidates for governor, actually more than a couple. And I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts on what the change in administration at the state level might mean for climate action and policy in California.
The reason we're sort of looking at each other is we sort of have two levels of things going on here in terms of appointees and civil service, right? So I'm civil service. I'm still going to be around after this is done. Do you guys want to start, or I can?
Well, I'll just say that I had a parent-teacher conference with my daughter's teacher 2 weeks ago, and her teacher said, well, I'd like to let you know that your daughter's going around telling everyone you're going to be fired at the end of the year. So fortunately, my daughter's teacher knew what that meant. But yeah, I'll leave that at that.
Yeah, I mean, Edie as the regulatory body in the room can really talk about what it, but I think in general, yes, we don't have a lot of job security at this end of the table, but these targets are written in stone, right? I mean, they are written in statute, and so California is not stopping just because this governor's leaving, and obviously I wish I had the statistic on hand of the latest kind of Public Policy Institute of California polling on climate change, but voters in California are immense supporters of the climate change agenda, always pushing us to do more, always pushing us to approach like intersectional climate solutions, I would say. So I just think this is changing the flavor of how it might play out, might change, but certainly the track we're on isn't going to change.
And so I would echo that. I think that one of the things that I think has been really important in California over the last couple of years is that you've seen the commitment to the climate change program from all levels and all places. And, the original, when we were asked to redo the scoping plan, it was as a result of the governor signing an executive order that says, hey, I think, we need to hit 40% by 2030. But that was adopted into the law. So the legislature adopted SB 32 and they put that into the law. And I think that that was a really important step to have the legislature endorse that, to have all of the government say this is important for us to do in California. The same thing with the cap and trade program. There was a huge effort last summer to have the legislature go through a process and adopt the cap and trade program by a 2/3 majority vote. It was an incredibly huge lift. It was, but I think it was really important. It was a statement to the world that California is on board with this program going forward, that this is what we're going to do, and that doesn't go away because we have a change in administration. I think the other thing that I would say is that we are looking at what we can do on this administration's watch to make sure that the things that this administration has started working on, that they're institutionalized is the word that we're using. So that's part of the conversation that we're having right now is what needs to happen this year so that we all who are still going to be here know what needs to happen as we're continuing forward. And then the other thing that I would just point out is that there are many candidates for governor, but the ones that appear to be sort of in the front runners, we'll know more after the primary, but the ones that are running ahead in the polls are all folks that have committed themselves to climate change in some way or another. As Claire mentioned, I think climate change and addressing climate change is a very popular it's a very popular thing in California, and I think that our political leaders see that. They want to lead in this area, and we've seen those commitments on the part of the folks that are running for governor in terms of the kinds of things that they've done in their current positions or in their past positions. And so I don't see California changing our commitment. I think you're right, the flavor could change. The kinds of things that they want to focus on may change. But we have very, very strong programs going forward. For the Air Resources Board, a lot of our programs are regulatory. They're going to be set in, as stony as a regulation is, but they're going to be set in stone in terms of what our targets are and how we're going to get there and the main structures. And I think that they're very durable structures that can withstand. So I think we're going to have to adapt a little bit, but I think the program will definitely continue.
Thank you. I think we have time for a question or two from the audience. Yes. Stand up and I can repeat it. Just. Hi, David.
I'm just wondering, maybe just in in summary, if you could each point to one area that we could be more ambitious as a state. What's missing?
So I'm trying to sound like I'm going to lean away from Claire. I think that we can be more ambitious on natural and working lands, and I think that I don't know if I should admit this or not. I might be the only person that has participated in the preparation of all 3 of our scoping plans. So one of my first jobs on climate was to develop the 2008 scoping plan. We did a 2013 scoping plan and a 2017 scoping plan. And I think Claire mentioned we talked about forests in the first scoping plan. We recognized that it was important, but we didn't really know how to handle it. The second scoping plan was we were reporting, but we really didn't take new commitments and new actions in that scoping plan. So in this last scoping plan that we worked on, I think that we understood now how important natural and working lands were, but we didn't have the tools or the capability of really integrating it into our program. And that's really what this natural and working land implementation plan, from my perspective, is about, that we need to do a better job of showing the connections between kind of the energy-based economy and the natural and working lands. We don't have good ways of looking at sort of the economics on the natural and working land side in the same way that we have models on the energy-based side. And I think that that would be a huge step forward if we could integrate these better, think about how they work together. And so that might not necessarily be, I think there's an ambition component of it, but part of it is understanding that and being able to do a better job of pulling that together. So
I won't be too predictable. No, we're joking because we spent a lot of time in conference rooms talking about natural working lands as the scoping plan was being written. But I mean, I think Edie was pointing to it, that it's not, if we want to increase our level of emission reductions ambitions, so get to carbon neutral, let's say, or even, beyond where we're currently set, we're at the point in California where we have, renewable portfolio standard is getting implemented faster than we thought. The governor is investing and really, bending existing and funding to invest more in zero emission vehicles. But I think one of the things that's starting to look at land use and management, which is what the rest of the world calls natural and working lands, is how land use plays into our ability to hit those other targets. So in the transportation sector, California has regional transportation strategies where, get very wonky here, but basically each region has to reduce its emissions from transportation, and that was not really a spatially explicit reporting associated with that. It was kind of focused on tailpipe emissions, so you could solve that through switching to zero emission vehicles, switching to walking and biking, and continue existing land use patterns. But now that we want to look at carbon sequestration, it forces us to look, okay, increasing urbanization of agricultural lands into forest lands starts to chew up carbon from that natural and working land sector, making it harder to hit the reductions and that. So it sort of really completes the picture of what are the emissions in California. And it does, I think, force us to sort of complicate some of the solutions, because California probably could get all of its wind or renewable energy from existing hydro, wind and solar over time as that's developed. I'm sure there's a much finer answer to that question, or Edie can tell me if I'm wrong. But I think we're seeing we can solve for that part of the system, but then on the forest management side, we are setting targets of treating 500,000 acres per year of fuel reduction and thinning. What do we do with all those trees, right? We don't have paper mills in California. You can't necessarily make lumber out of them. They need to potentially go to bioenergy or biofuels. They have to be diverted from landfills. But the same goes for every organic waste stream in this state. So it forces us to kind of solve for that whole system rather than just the pieces. And I think that is going to be the biggest challenge maybe for the next governor on climate change, in addition to keeping this all going, is really solving for that whole system.
Yeah, I'll agree with, definitely I agree with Edie and Claire. I think, really working on increasing and ramping up the natural working lands piece. Also, just as Claire said, really looking holistically, systems approach. Certainly in agriculture, it's the same. Really looking at taking down some of the silos in how we think as government, and really think about it much more holistically as in the agricultural industry as a whole. So thinking about how do our food processors and our transportation and getting food to market, and how does that all fit together in a systems approach that is not only a market-based approach, but also we're providing solutions to them as well. So really looking comprehensively at that systems in our land base for sure, as we think about how our development patterns are going to be, and really looking and planning for climate change in a much more broader scope is something I think that we'll see more of.
Well, thank you, and I think we're just about out of time at this point, so I'm wondering if you could all join me in thanking our panelists for interesting presentation.